kind of lost me at data transfer. I don't know what's going on here.
FTP, file transfer protocol.
Now, what we have to remember is that not every position can be changed to every other position.
And making sure that the users we have now stay happy and stay on while trying to attract some other people to play it.
They make
Hustle home, but yeah. No, that's over in a heartbeat. Ain't got any problem with
that. Welcome to another This, That, and the Other. I'm your host, Magic, and today we're going to do a couple tutorials. Tutorial 2 talks about position change, and there's actually a part within that tutorial where we demonstrate how a player's values change if there's a position change made. And the follow-up to that is also available today, in that we show what those values would be if that individual player had another year on the team. So essentially, let's say changing him from when he's a freshman to what happens to those numbers when he's a sophomore, and how that 1 year of already having been in that initial position affects the values of that position change. Let's go ahead and look at position change tutorial. This is tutorial number 2, I believe, on the tutorial list. Welcome to another tutorial. This is a D2 team that is in the job change period, so rollover has not occurred yet. So we will not have any recruits showing up on our recruiting menu or recruiting summary. So it's still as was when the season concluded. In this tutorial, I want to show you what happens when you try to change a player's position after the 5th game of the season. As you can see, this team is 5-8, so it's well beyond the 5th game of the season, but we can at least get an idea of what his values would have been given a position change were available to make. This is his individual player change. You get there simply by player page, I should say. You get there by simply clicking on his hyperlink. These green numbers indicate growth for this season in that particular rating. The red, of course, is a decline in that particular rating. What we want to try to do is the position change. And when you click on the position change tab, quarterbacks can play practically any position except for in the trenches. You don't see offensive linemen, defensive linemen there, but they can be converted to any of these. Now, granted, you convert a quarterback to defensive back or linebacker, chances are his tackling is not that great. In this guy's case, you can see it's a 17, so do you really want to move him to defense? I would not. But anyway, let's say we want to move him to a running back. 2 things will be shown after the 5th game of the season. One of those things occurs regardless of what game it is, and that is his value changes for his particular ratings. As you can see, if we move that quarterback to a running back and you do what we just did here, regardless if it's the preseason, the first game, the last game, whatever, you will see those numbers change. After the 5th game of the season, what you will see is this warning stating that you cannot change positions after first 5 games of the active season. But it gives you an idea of where his numbers would fall or come out to if you were to make a position change. If you move him to tight end, those numbers are going to change a little bit. As a quarterback moving to tight end, you would expect his speed to increase, which it does. So there's kind of information there that before you click the "Are you sure?" change button, as would be available if this was prior to the 5th game of the season, you would see the player actually change and carry those new ratings with him into that new position. As far as IQ, if we look up here, his IQ doesn't change. If he's going from a quarterback to a running back, the offensive IQ values do not change. The defensive ones will change because he is not a defensive player right now. So when you click back on formation after he has been changed, that's when you'll see his defensive values. Again, he's not a defensive player now, so those defensive values are not shown. That's one of the things that you really would like to see. It's not necessarily a deal breaker, if you will, but it's one of the things that would be nice to see if you do intend to change an offensive guy to a defensive guy or vice versa. So that's a little bit on the position change. The other thing I wanted to bring out to your attention is we're going to actually record an individual, what his values are as a freshman, because the higher the player is in his career, the more effect a position change has on his new ratings. And those effects are not to the good, they're to the bad. For instance, looking at a senior quarterback, if we were to try and change him to any other player, his numbers are going to fall through the floor. We can see he's got 48 speed, elusiveness, strength. Those are the ones we're looking at. So, 48 speed, 41 strength. Let's just look at those for right now. Not saying that those are core values that we need to pay attention to for the quarterback. Those are just some of the things I know will change, and they'll be pretty drastic compared to what we did with the freshman. So we'll hit the change tab. Let's make him a running back. And this time, instead of it being a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 number change, you can see these big numbers. 23 for his game instinct, 29 here. His speed doesn't change because that's one of the things where running back, wide receiver, quarterback, they're generally the same category when it comes to speed rating. As we mentioned previously with the other example, you move him to tight end, you're going to expect to see that speed rating go up. But again, these other values down here suffer some pretty big losses compared to what a freshman would experience. And that again is a senior. So we're going to record a freshman running back, Corey Rouse. And we're going to keep his values and then compare them to when he is a sophomore, which will be after rollover. And if we tried to do a position change, how much those numbers actually change. So let's go ahead and hit the position change button, or tab I should say, and we're going to change him to a wide receiver. Those two positions are relatively close. So we're going to, you see what those values are. And earlier on the senior quarterback, these numbers down here were your higher double-digit numbers. As I said, these are going to be in single digits. He is a freshman. So those are his values as a freshman. When the season rolls over, I'm going to go to this page and do the same thing with him being a sophomore. And what I anticipate that we'll see is instead of a -8, it may be a 12 or a 13 here. Same with technique. Any number that are red, it's going to be a little bit higher, simply because he's now a year further into his career, and he's not going to be very receptive to a position change. That's just from a player aspect, but his elusiveness, technique, game instinct, those three generally suffer quite a bit the higher up you go. All right, so that's a little bit of a position change tutorial on what you can expect to see when you're making position changes.
Well, hopefully that was informative for some of you. I know a lot of the veterans are well aware of that activity and how those numbers fluctuate given what position a particular player is being transferred to or changed to. Again, the thing to remember is the longer they're in their career, the more effect a position change has on a player and the more a negative effect that is. This second video or tutorial is essentially the piggyback off the first one, where we look at that running back again now that he's had another year under his belt. So let's take a look at that.
Hello everyone, and I'm providing a follow-up to a previous tutorial 2, position change, where the discussion was regarding Corey Rouse, the running back, as a freshman, and if we were to change him to a wide receiver, what his values would look like as far as which of the attributes would fall, which one of them would rise. And I had mentioned that once he's a sophomore, those values tend to take a bit more of a hit because now he's further into his career and a little more reluctant to change positions per se. What you're seeing on the screen is a capture from that position change tutorial where Rouse was shown as a freshman, and now today in the 11th game of the season you can see he's a sophomore, and the position change going from running back to wide receiver, if we were able to do it, since it's after the 5th game of the season we're unable to do that, but if we were able to do that, you can do a comparison of those values and see the changes. The one that really sticks out is the drop in his work ethic. Now, bear in mind, too, that this is the 11th game of the season, so his numbers have improved overall because of his growth from his playing time and practice time. So the starting point for this comparison between when he was a freshman and now as a sophomore is a little bit different because he's grown some as a sophomore. But you can see the result in the drop for work ethic, for instance, would drop him all the way down to 27. Whereas a freshman, if we made the change then, or if we were able to have made the change then, he would have only dropped down to a 30. Bear in mind as well the fact that the athleticism and speed, durability, which durability is really not a factor the way the game's laid out now because there are no injuries. But athleticism and speed, there's really no change in those dropping or increasing. Those are pretty much standard when it comes to switching a wide receiver to a running back or a running back to a wide receiver. Those categories are about the same for each of those positions. Now, if we were to, say, change a tight end or a running back wide receiver to a tight end, that speed, you would see that increase because those positions aren't necessarily the same. It would be expected that an individual who's a running back or a wide receiver in a tight end position would have a lot more speed. So anyway, this is just a follow-up as promised from that tutorial 2, so you can see some of the differences in the numbers. And of course, these will get worse as he progresses into his career. So if you tried to do a position change as a junior, these numbers would fall as well. Now, one thing I will admit is position scarcity. So what that means essentially is if he has very few positions or players ahead of him as a wide receiver, then his numbers may not drop as much. For instance, if you're running a shotgun formation where 4 wide receivers are on every play and you've got 3 on the roster, then he would recognize that he would be filling that additional position. There'd be less challenge for playing time, and his numbers wouldn't necessarily fall as much. Inversely, if you've got 10 wide receivers on the roster and you try to change him from a running back to a wide receiver, that lack of playing opportunity impacts his numbers to where he will fall even more so. Anyway, this is just, like I said, a follow-up on that particular tutorial. Hope it's been helpful for you.
Hope it has been helpful for you. I know there's been some questions about how to calculate those drops from year to year to year. And like I said, there's so much that goes into that it's really case-by-case basis, unfortunately. There's the mathematical equations or formulas to know that so far in advance to help you decide whether you want to change them as a freshman, sophomore, etc. Just aren't there. So trial and error, and do what's best for your team at the time. You know, if you're building a team for the future, you may consider things for a certain option. If you're trying to structure the team to win now, then other considerations come into play as well. So there's a lot that goes into your decision making when it comes to changing players. The other tutorial and last tutorial we'll show on this particular show is the one on roles and positions. So each position has a role. At D3, you saw that it was a singular or top level role. You had quarterback, running back, wide receiver, etc. Once you get to D2, it becomes a little more complex in that you have sub roles. So your running back, for instance, would have a fullback position, would have a possession running back, speed position, and it also has an additional option for your choosing. The wide receivers is the same way, has variety, as do O linemen, as do your defensive players. So we'll get into the role ratings and how those position numbers identify the best players for what particular responsibility or role.
Talking about position roles. Normally I would go down the tabs and in some type of order, which we'll get back to in subsequent videos, but this particular aspect of the game actually has tentacles that reach out into other areas of the game. So in order to better understand those areas and understand what you're seeing when we get to those areas, I wanted to bring into play position roles because they are basically spread throughout the game. And you can find position roles in your coaching tab down at the bottom or over to the far right, either one. In D3, this is an aspect of the game you didn't have available to you. You had the default setting based on the What If Sports standards, where they decided to put emphasis, if you will, on certain cores. These values that you see must equal 100 for each row. We're looking at the quarterback position, and in the quarterback position, you've got 2 additional spots that you didn't have at D3, and that is a position for a rushing quarterback and a position for quarterback user 1. Now, that is just the naming structure or naming architecture that is in place by What If Sports. You can't change the names of those particular positions. However, just because the name says quarterback rushing does not mean that that has to be your rushing quarterback position when it comes to the depth chart. And we'll get into exactly what I mean by that later on. But the basic understanding and thing you need to recognize is just because a position says something here as a sub position, like we have here with quarterback, the sub position would be rushing, the other one being user 1. You can design that position and tailor it based on the values that you place on each of these cores. For instance, let's say that contrary to what it says, rushing quarterback, you wanted this particular quarterback to do nothing but throw the ball. Well, in that case, you don't necessarily want a high value for speed. You want to put a little more emphasis on his strength, the game instinct, his technique, maybe elusiveness to avoid some of those sacks. Definitely athleticism as well. What you really don't need, and the way you edit these is click the pencil edit attribute. What you really don't need is any value in durability, because the game no longer has injuries. That was an important aspect a decade or more ago, when the game did have injuries and your players could get hurt. To kind of help your stud stay in playing condition, you would put some value on the durability aspect. So just know that there should never be a number here. You are wasting opportunity. As these category headers go, athleticism, speed, durability, work ethic, stamina, strength, blocking, tackling, hands, instinct, that's your game instinct, your elusiveness and technique, and then your total number. This is not the player's total number. This is the total number of value points you're assigning to each of these categories. And again, this must equal 100 when you're done. And let's say that, as I mentioned already, we want to make this guy a throwing quarterback. We don't necessarily worry about speed. We simply knock the speed down to, let's say, 10. His strength is at 20. Elusiveness is 18. We want him to be a little bit smarter, or work on him becoming smarter than becoming elusive. So for this guy's benefit, I'm going to make him an 18. I'm going to knock his elusiveness down to 16, but I want him to have some good technique in throwing the ball. So now we're at 93, which means that we have a blessing because we can add some more value. Let's say we want to beef up his athleticism. We go to 14. Once you click out of that box, the value to the right changes, so you've got an understanding of where you are and how much you've got left to allocate. Let's take this game instinct to 19, his technique to 19, and let's beef up his strength to 22. Now we're at 100. Okay, let's say that we want to make user number 1 our running quarterback, just for sake of argument. That's where we would jack up the speed. Let's say we want the speed to be 25. His elusiveness, we want to make it 25. Definitely got some good technique. We'll leave it around 20. Don't necessarily need him to be too smart running the ball, so we're going to knock that down to 20. And his athleticism, we definitely want him to be athletic, so we want to see that at 14. We're happy with those numbers, but if we look to the right, that's 129. We have 29 points over our allowed limit, which is that 100. So we need to start decreasing these numbers. Let's drop this by 2. Let's drop that by 2. And we'll drop that by 2. And then drop this by 2. Let's see. I went up somewhere, didn't I? So that didn't help us. I went up somewhere. Let's try this. As you can see, you can play with these numbers to get them down to where you want them based on your preference, basically, and you'll gain some of the understanding of how these affect the other portions of the game as we go into those videos. Still over 12, so we're going to have to make some major cuts on this guy. See where our issues are. Oh, let's make him down to 10 here. And the strength for a running back, we really don't need him all that strong necessarily. So I'm happy with those numbers. So is the game. It shows 100. Now we hit save. Now bear in mind, these are just arbitrary numbers. I'm throwing them out there. Again, you can set these up to be whatever you want based on where you want to emphasize the importance for that particular position. So that was the quarterback. Now, we'll get into a little bit more of what these numbers affect later on. Running back, you'll see a few more options to you. You've got a running back. You've got a fullback, the speed running back, the power running back, and possession running back. And again, there's that user 1. So, you can make your fullback, your speed running back, and your power back, your possession back. You can change the values for that position to make that particular player fit that style or that category based on those values. But why confuse yourself? Get as close to these names for these particular positions, these sub positions as I call them, as possible. Let's click that pencil again for the edit. Fullback, definitely want him to be strong, be a good blocker. Technique is a little bit low. Athleticism is a bit low. This 30 number, I try not to go over about 25 if I can help it. So let's knock this down to 30. Blocking down to 27. And let's get his technique up. We want his technique at about 14, just for giggles here. And then we'll boost his athleticism. We'll boost that up as well. Now we're showing that the fullback, we really don't care about his speed. We really don't want to emphasize his speed. Well, I want him to at least be able to get out of his stance mentally. You know, that's kind of what I'm thinking. So what if we knock this down to 25 and add a couple over here for him? Let's add 3, 4, let's make it 5. And then again, there's that durability. We don't care about that. For me, work ethic, I don't care about too much about his work ethic. That's going to come with playing time, and that's another video. So I generally leave a 0 there. Stamina, again, that's going to depend on how long you want the player in the game. Now, that's not, don't confuse that with the substitution rate that we saw in the previous video. This is talking about increasing his stamina to get him into the position of being in the game the longest. Now, having a high number here does not necessarily increase his stamina as a person, and I misspoke. It indicates that that's where you have emphasis. You want the player in this position who has a lot of stamina. So you're going to make that value higher. When we're dealing with practice plan, which will be another video, that's when those numbers will actually indicate where they're going to improve. So apologies for misspeaking on that one, but these numbers indicate where you're putting emphasis based on what you expect to see from those players. So now he's at 98, which means we have 2 more. I don't care about his stamina, so now that's going to make 5 more that we can allocate somewhere. And I'm going to bump his speed up to 10. I want him a little bit faster, even though he is a fullback. So that would be a setting for your fullback. Possession, let's say we want him to be, we're concerned about his athleticism for about a 10 value. We want him to have some speed, definitely some elusiveness, some good technique to catch the ball. So we're going to kind of emphasize that a little bit more. We want him to be a pretty smart player. Don't necessarily want him to be strong if he's going out for catching. We want more in the hands category, so I would knock that down. Let's just say 15, and then we can bump up his hands. We definitely want him to have some good hands, so we're going to put an emphasis or a value of about 15 there. You know, we don't want somebody who's got low hand rating, and that's what would show up when we're looking at our roster or our player rating page, which we'll show in another video. So now we're at 115, so we're 15 over. So let's take about 4 or 5 off of this, drop it down to 18 here as well. We'll go 17. We'll knock that down to 10. There's that stamina again. Let's go with a 0 there, a 0 there, and a 0 there. Now we've got 1 that we can allocate, and we're going to throw it on the technique. So anyway, now we've got a possession running back setup. So that's just a quick little overview of how you set position roles. And in the subsequent video, we're going to get into how those are important.
And again, hopefully that was beneficial to some of you. I know that it can be quite lengthy at times, and that's why I've chosen to break some of these tutorials out in smaller chunks, if you will. So again, hopefully that helps. If you have suggestions for tutorials, or you have ideas about something else that needs to be presented, you know, put it on the forum, put it on that TTATO pinned thread, and we'll look at it. And who knows, we might just include it. May even get you on to present it as a tutorial or whatever the idea is that you have, especially if it's something unique or a way of saving steps. Those are always beneficial to the group as a whole. So, but for the most part, it's just an insight as to how D2 and above differ from D3, because we've had a lot of coaches come in on the recent promotions, and I know they play at D3 and everything is pretty basic and very little customization available. And then they move up to D2 and boom, the eyes are wide open then. And a lot of questions start to circle around. So we're here to answer those questions. And hopefully some of these tutorials will help answer some of those as well. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. This has been another episode of This, That, and the Other. I'm your host, Magic, and we'll see you next time.